Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Book Review Podcast. I'm Gilbert Cruz, the new editor of the Books Desk here at the New York Times. And for the next many months, we'll be highlighting great conversations from our decade-plus archive. We're planning a new iteration of this podcast, and as a result, we're going to take a while to figure out what that might sound like. Until then, we hope you enjoy these trips down memory lane. Celeste Ng's new novel, Our Missing Hearts, takes place in a United States where certain books are destroyed, Asian Americans face constant violence, and children are taken away from families who speak out against the government. It feels far off, but not so far off. As Stephen King writes in his review of Ng's book, her dystopia feels milder than in books like 1984 or The Handmaid's Tale. The effect, quote, makes it more believable and hence more upsetting. This week, we're rerunning Ng's appearance from 2017 on the podcast when she spoke to us for the release of her last novel, Little Fires Everywhere.
Celeste, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about the novel, but let's start with the title, which comes from a quote from the book.
Yeah, the title, Little Fires Everywhere, is both metaphorical and literal. There are quite a number of metaphorical fires burning in this neighborhood and in between these two families that sort of get entangled with each other. But the book actually opens with a literal house fire. The house of the Richardsons, one of the main families in the book, is burning to the ground, and they find out soon that the youngest child, Izzy, has set the fire.
So it's interesting because your first book, Everything I Never Told You, your debut, began with a dead girl, and you were sort of trying to figure out, reconstruct what happened. This new novel begins with a fire, and you're saying that we know who set the fire?
Yes. I didn't realize that I had done that until, people started reading the second book and they pointed out, you like to give away the endings of your book right at the beginning. But I guess this really speaks to my impulse to try and get the reader to focus not on what is going to happen, but how did this happen? Mm-hmm. How did these people get into this state? What were all of the sort of interpersonal relationships that led up to this point?
What is it about that process that interests you as a writer?
Well, I'm frankly just always trying to write towards something that I don't understand. That's usually where a story starts for me. I go, how could this have happened? Or how could this person do this thing? And in writing out the story and in trying to get into their mindset and their background, that's sort of how I create the story. And that's frankly just always what draws me into any piece of writing is sort of the human element of it. And so that's why I think I always want the reader to be focusing on the, not a whodunit, but how this happened.
But it's interesting because some writers who construct a novel that is in some way a thriller, and I think this book is in some ways a kind of thriller, or a not whodunit, as you said, but a how did this happen? And sometimes the authors say, well, I actually didn't know how it was going to end. It unspooled itself. So you know how it's going to end, but do you know how it is that they got there? Or is that a process that you discover as you're writing?
Before I can start writing, I always have to have a general idea of where I think the book is going. I'm not always right, but I always sort of need to have a destination to kind of drive towards, in other words. And the surprises for me come along the way in sort of figuring out exactly why these people did all the things that they did. So I guess it's a little bit like having a road trip plan where you have a destination, but you don't have a specific itinerary. You're going in that direction, but You leave yourself some space to explore along the way.
So speaking of destination, both of the books are set in Shaker Heights, and you grew up in part in Shaker Heights. Did you grow up thinking, I'm going to write about this place one day?
Well, I didn't. The first book is set in sort of a fictionalized town, but I did draw on Shaker Heights to kind of imagine what a small Ohio town might be like. When I was growing up in Shaker Heights, I loved it, and I still do love it. I'm very fond of it, and I have a lot of nostalgia for it. And it was only sort of when I moved away and I learned that a lot of the things I had grown up with were actually not as common or as typical as I thought they'd been. That was when the possibilities for fiction kind of came alive for me.
What was it that wasn't as common as you thought?
Well, I mean, both sort of small, sort of silly surface things and also sort of larger philosophical things. So the silly, smaller things are the things like, I talk about some of them in the book, like on garbage day, you don't put your garbage cans on the curb because that makes the street look messy. And the city instead has little garbage trucks that pick up the garbage in the back of your house and take it out. So they go down every person's driveway. or things like that two-family houses have to be sort of disguised as one-family house. So they can only have one front door and one front door light. A lot of sort of little surface things like that I didn't realize weren't typical. Until I moved away. But then there are also larger things like the community is very focused on race, and they try to make that really a topic of conversation, that there's a race relations group at the high school. Fifth and sixth graders go through sort of a race awareness training, and then often when they get to high school, they become part of the race relations group and come back and complete the cycle. And I didn't realize that that wasn't something that every community did. I didn't realize that Shaker Heights was sort of so based on principles and idealism, and that it really was such an idealism-driven town. And I didn't realize that other communities didn't have that sort of sense of themselves as being exemplars.
A lot of it sounds like, too, the novel is about, deceptive appearances, that things aren't always the way they seem, both, with that, the garbage being hidden and the two family houses being disguised at one. And it sounds like maybe that applies as well to race relations in the town.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a real difference between sort of the surface of things and then sort of what the true state of things is. For example, Lexi, the oldest daughter in the Richardson family, is dating a black student at her school, one of her black classmates, and she says, "Oh, we don't see race. I don't see race." But he's a little bit more aware of race than she is.
Right.
He's sort of aware of the ways in which he's going to be seen differently dating a white girl than she will be seen dating a black boy. And that's sort of a theme throughout, that everyone in here, I think there's a difference between the surface of who they appear to be and then who they actually are inside, all the way down to the artwork that Mia, the sort of mother who comes in from out of town, creates.
And right, and she says no one sees race here, right? So like not just her, but
nobody sees race here,
Yeah.
right? Exactly. Which, I don't think has ever been true for anyone who says it. And even if it is true, it's a problematic sort of stance to take.
It's interesting, though. You set this book in the past, the not too distant past, in the late 90s, and your first book was set in 1977. Why those periods?
Well, the first book, Everything I Never Told You, the 70s seemed like a time that really sort of highlighted all of the things that I realized that this family was wrestling with, especially with regard to women's roles and with regard to race. It was sort of before a time that women becoming doctors wouldn't be something that would make you turn your head. In this book, I set it in the 90s first just on a whim because that was the era that I knew Shaker Heights in. That was the era in which I grew up in Shaker Heights. And so it was a world and a time that I knew very intimately. But it did also work out really well because it allowed the characters first to have a little bit of secrecy. It was in the pre-cell phone era, in the pre-internet era, or, internet was sort of just barely beginning. You had to dial up and wait for the modem to connect and all of that stuff. And in an era where it would have been a little bit easier to conceal things about yourself or about your past, and it was harder for other people to find you. That was something that I really needed the characters to have that sort of space to hide in. But what ended up happening was that as I started to write, I realized that that's 20 years ago, and that seems sort of far away, but not as far away as it ought to be. That a lot of the discussions about race that the characters are having, we're still having now, frankly.
Right. It's interesting. Laura Lippman was talking about her next novel, Sunburn, which isn't out yet. I heard her talking about it today, and she said it in 1995. And the reason she gave was that was the last year that you could just kind of disappear. Originally when this first came up, it was like, do you set it pre-cell phone or post-cell phone? And then it became pre-smartphone or post-smartphone, and pre-internet and post-internet. And it's interesting that that's become a kind of dividing point because it affects storytelling so much.
It does, and I'm seeing some books start to come out in stories where they really sort of make good use of text messaging or following somebody's phone on GPS. And I feel like that opens up new possibilities, but it also definitely closes off some certain possibilities. In the novel, there are times when a character needs to know something, and they really have to write to the public records office and try and get that information. They have to wait for this information to come back to them. And now, whether you put your information in or not, there are websites that kind of aggregate all kinds of public data and will list all the addresses you have ever lived at. And everyone who's ever lived there with you and all of your family members. It's like you said, it's harder to disappear. You would have to work a lot harder at it now, I think, than before 1995.
And it's interesting, too, as you said, it was easier to keep secrets. And both of these novels involve, to a certain extent, the secret lives of teenagers. And it's interesting how teenage girls in particular seem well suited to, to novels of intrigue. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that teenagers are in that sort of weird liminal space where they're not children, so they do have secrets that they want to keep, but they're not adults, and so they don't really know how to keep those secrets exactly. Or the adults in their lives still think that they deserve to know what's going on in their children's lives. And so I feel like teenagers naturally kind of want to keep some of their secrets to themselves as they sort of realize their own agency. And yet, of course, they're not really granted the right to hold all of those secrets. They still live with their parents most of the time. They're still dependent. And they don't get to make a lot of their own decisions. And so I feel like that's sort of a natural period in which you learn about secrets. You learn to keep important secrets, right? That's sort of how I remember a lot of my teenage years being, is sort of like, which secrets was I keeping for which friends and vice versa? Who could you trust? Who couldn't you trust?
Mm-hmm. Your first novel, Everything I Never Told You, you had an amazing, highly unusual experience for a debut author in that it became a mega bestseller. I think Amazon for the first time named it the best book of the year, and it was your book. What was that like?
Really surreal, honestly. It's sort of beyond the wild fantasies that, any beginning writer could come up with. I feel just really lucky that the book found such a receptive audience, because I know that it's hard to publish a novel. It's hard to be a debut author. And it put a little pressure on me this time to try and make sure that I didn't disappoint all of those readers who had loved my first book, but I still wanted to try and stretch a little and do something new. So I hope I succeeded in that. Yeah,
I was going to say, it sounds like it's also terrifying for like a sophomore novelist trying to live up to those expectations. In trying to do something new, what were your goals there? What were you trying to do differently in this book as a writer?
One thing that I wanted to try to do was to write sort of on a little bit bigger of a canvas. So the first novel I kind of deliberately kept really about the family. Almost the whole novel takes place in the house. It's almost a sort of claustrophobic atmosphere. And that was sort of the amount of space that I felt like I could handle. And I wanted to branch out a little bit bigger this time, to look, not just at a family, but at a couple families, at the town, and to look at some of the larger issues that were there. That felt to me like something that the novel gave you space to do that a short story doesn't always. And, it seemed like a fun experiment to try. Well,
our reviewer, Eleanor Henderson, said that this novel is even more ambitious and accomplished than her debut. So it seems, at least in our pages, according to our reviewer, that you succeeded in that. So, Celeste, thank you again for being here, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much, Pamela.
Recently, as part of our recurring series, The Essentials, which helps readers wade through authors with substantial backlists, we took a look at Judy Blume. While she's best known for her work for younger readers, her most recent novel, 2015's In the Unlikely Event, was aimed squarely at adults. We spoke to her upon that book's release and are presenting that conversation here.
Judy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
This is a book, we should say up front, for adults. Did you know when you started it, this is a book for grown-ups?
I never know. And to tell you the truth, I hate putting books into categories because, when I was 12 and 13, there were no YA books, so I was reading widely in my parents' bookshelves, and so I was reading everything. And so if a teenager wants to read this book, great. Why not?
The protagonist of the book is a teenager at the center of it. Ninth grade Jewish girl, Miri Ammerman. Tell us about her.
The whole book came to me at once. So it wasn't so much Miri, nor did I know at that time that everyone would say that Miri is the main character. I guess she must be because everybody says she is. But because I was trying to create three families, and several generations in each family. I guess I didn't think of it that way, although, yes, Mary's voice starts it and kind of ends it, and so I guess she is the main character. Yeah, I like her, Mary. Well, I have to like them all, or why spend 5 years of my life with them? And that's what it's taken.
How long were you thinking about the book before you started writing, or did you come up with this idea and start writing?
It came in a flash to me, unlike any other book I've ever written. I mean, my books, usually come with a character and a loose idea, and I know where I'm starting, and I think I know where I'm going, but maybe I'm not, and I don't know anything that's going to happen in the middle. And this book came to me in a flash. I knew this story. This story's been inside me since I'm 14 years old. I was younger than Mary. And I'm a writer, and I've been writing for 40-something years, and I never thought about writing this story, and I don't quite understand that unless the events were so buried, and yet they weren't so buried because my daughter became an airline pilot. When she read, an early draft of the book, she said, "Mother, I can't believe this. You never told me this story." So maybe it was. Now I think, okay, Judy, this is the book you were born to write, to tell this story, to write this book.
So tell me about this flash moment. You said that it came to you in a flash. Do you remember where you were?
Yes, it was only in 2009, so I remember it very well. It was at the Key West Literary Seminar. I'm on the board, and I love to be there. A then young and not very well-known writer named Rachel Kushner. The theme that year, each year it's a different theme, and the theme in 2009 was New Voices. She had been invited as a new voice, and she was on stage talking about her first novel, Telex from Cuba, a book that I had loved very much. And she was talking about where she got the idea, because everybody always wants to know, where do you get your ideas? And she said, well, stories that her mother told her about having grown up in Cuba in the 50s. Now, it wasn't anything to do with Cuba that jumped, that knocked me over the head. It was in the 50s. And when she said stories in the 50s, I mean, truly, the light bulb went off over my head, and it was like, oh my God, I have a story, and I have to tell this story. And this came to me unlike any other book. It came to me in that flash with plot and characters, not specific characters, but I knew that there would be three families. I knew that it would involve the three crashes, take place in, my hometown of Elizabeth, New Jersey in the winter of 51, 52. I just knew I couldn't wait to start. I've never felt that way. I usually dread starting, and that was over a weekend, and on Monday morning I began my research, which lasted, I guess, about 5 months until, people who know me and care about me and understand nonfiction writing said to me, yes, we know, Judy, you're having a wonderful time doing the research, but now you have to start to write the book and tell the story. And that was January 2009. I, in my defense, I did take 2 years off to work on the movie of Tiger Eyes.
Your son was involved with that, correct?
Yes, we wrote the screenplay together and he directed it, yes. A very, very happy experience.
Did the writing come easily once you had that idea and you had done that research? When you sat down to write it, did it just flow? Did it feel like it had been a long time since you'd written a novel for adults, or did it just come to you?
No, that doesn't make any difference because, during those years, it's not as if I hadn't been writing. I wrote, 4 chapter books for young children and maybe even a fudge book. And, I wasted a lot of time doing movie scripts and things that were never going to happen. But, they're all learning experiences and they were interesting. That wasn't the problem. I mean, the problem is the same thing every time I start. It's like, it's hard. It wasn't in the beginning. I mean, I had a lot of stuff inside me and it just came spilling out. It's much harder now because I don't want to repeat myself and I want to be fresh and spontaneous. And this book was a real challenge.
What was the particular challenge?
What was the challenge?
Yeah, with this book in particular. What was the most challenging part of it?
There are a lot of characters and a lot of events. I don't write descriptive prose well. I try never to write descriptive prose, and I'm thankful for the wonderful newspaper reporters of the day, because through their stories, I was able to describe these horrific events. I don't think I would have been able to do it otherwise, and I was determined to use the language of the 50s. You know, I mean, it wasn't like you could come home from school or work and put on the TV and there would be all the news coverage, because while we had TV, there was no news coverage like this. So it was up to them to paint the picture of what was going on, and up to the photographers who worked with the papers. In fact, there was a boy in school just a year ahead of me who ran out into the night. He lived near the third crash and took pictures. And he actually sold those photos to the local newspaper, now defunct, the Elizabeth Daily Journal. I don't know that I ever saw his pictures, but I certainly knew him well.
You know, when you went back and read all those newspapers, the language that they used, the way in which they wrote must have been so different because of people's reliance on print.
You know, my favorite was broke in half like a swollen cream puff, describing a plane that came down. It broke in half like a swollen cream puff. And then there was another description that I really had to use, which was, you know, fell from the sky like a wounded, angry bird. I mean, we don't do that anymore. We don't use that kind of language anymore. And so I recently read somewhere that, you know, Blume's descriptions are a little purple prosy there. I'm thinking, you know, they're not my descriptions. This is the way it was described in the newspapers. And thank goodness, you know, for the newspapers. I don't really think I read the newspapers then. What I knew, I did know a lot. I mean, my father was a dentist. The most autobiographical character, or the character who's most like someone I know, whichever way you want to put it, is Dr. O, the dentist in the book, based on my father, the guy that everybody loved. All the kids liked to be at our house because he was fun, and he was a wonderful guy.
In all the books that you've written, had you written about your father in this way before, sort of finding him
in your very favorite of my books, starring Sally J. Friedman as herself, which is truly my most autobiographical book. This book is not autobiographical, although people seem to think that it is. It's not. It's not about my coming of age. You know, it's so fictional. But starring Sally J. Friedman as herself is autobiographical in that that's the kind of kid I was, and that was my family.
The book has just come out, but you've already done quite a bit of media already. Has anything in the reception so far surprised you?
I've read, you know, what certain readers have said about it. I'm always, you know, fascinated by people who either see it the same way I do, and then it's like, oh, yes, or see it in a completely different way than I do. Like, you know, that this is Blume's own coming of age. I swear to you, this is not Blume's coming of age, but I was there. Unlike Miri, I never saw a crash, but I have heard now from many people who either had seen it as children or who were somehow touched by it, whose families were touched by what happened. And I'm hoping that I get to meet a lot of them on the road.
I imagine when you do meet your readers often that the reading of your books is sort of part of so many people's coming of age story. What does that feel like for you when people come up to you and say, "Oh my God, Judy Blume, Deanie," or "Oh my God, Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing"?
Well, it's wonderful. It's very satisfying, and there's a lot of tears on both sides. I always keep Kleenex on the table. But this is not something that I can think about every day, or I'd be paralyzed. I would never be able to write because it would be too scary. The idea of disappointing my fans. I have to shoo that thought away. This is a book, whether or not it satisfies or disappoints my fans, this is a book that I had to write. I'm glad that I did, and I'm glad that it's over, and that now all I have to do is talk about it. I find it interesting to talk about it, and it's different, and, it's a time and a place.
Those were our conversations with Celeste Ng from 2017 and Judy Blume from 2015. We'll have more from the Book Review Podcast archive next week. Thank you for listening.